of the history and heritage of our civic life and the functions of our civic institutions. Second, to help students develop civic skills, to gain skills such as the ability to analyze text and determine the reliability of sources, and to gain an understanding of the ways in which civic institutions operate and how individuals can be involved in civic life. Put simply, if you're upset over your garbage service, don't write your state legislator, write your mayor or city council. Civic learning also seeks to help students develop a civic disposition, to gain values such as an appreciation for free speech, civil discourse, and understanding perspectives that differ from one's own, as well as the disposition to be civically engaged lifelong. And finally, civic learning done right helps develop civic behaviors, to develop civic and political habits and behaviors which include voting, engagement, deliberative discussions, volunteering, attending public meetings, and other activities related to civic life. So what is the status of civic education in our nation today? It is still taught in virtually every single school in the country. Our concern, though, is over the quantity of civic learning and the quality of civic learning that's provided to school kids today. The most reliable national measure we have on how well our schools are doing in providing civic education is the National Assessment of Educational Progress Test in civics. The 8th grade NAEP in civics was released just a couple of months ago. And since the beginning of the administration of NAEPs in civics, scores have been flat, and this dates back to 1998, with barely 25% aggregate of students being able to demonstrate a frankly dumbed down proficient status in this area. Why is this so? Well, don't blame the teachers. They want to teach civics and they want to do it in a 21st century manner. The problem we have is ever since an October night in 1957, when the then Soviet Union launched a basketball size thing into space called Sputnik, we've had periodic national panics over how well we're doing in STEM, in science, in engineering, in mathematics, and more recently in English. Certainly during the No Child Left Behind era and during the Common Core era, time and attention for civic education was squeezed. So our coalition, the Civics Now Coalition, is dedicated to helping every single state policymaker reverse this trend, provide adequate attention to civics. You know, there's still 9 states in the nation where there is no state requirement you take a civics course. And depending on how you want to judge it, there are only 8 or 9 states in the country that have meaningful assessment in civic learning. And folks, if it isn't tested, it isn't taught, isn't trite, it's the reality in every school in the country. School administrators are disincentivized from providing the time and resources necessary for civics because they're not assessed on it. Their jobs depend on their school's performance in math, English, the reading arts, largely. That's something we've got to change. The Civics Now Coalition, in consultation with allies across this country, have developed a policy menu that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. But now I'd like to turn this over to my friend, Shawn Healy, to talk about what effective civic learning looks like and the 6 proven practices plus in civic learning. Dr. Healy.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you to NCSL for this opportunity to speak about something that both Ted and I are deeply passionate about. And I want to start from a place of, I started my career as a high school civics teacher, and actually the picture on the screen, this introductory picture is from something called the legislative semester. I had the great privilege, my second teaching job in 2001 was at a high school called Community High School in West Chicago. And I walked into a school that had a required semester-long government class. State didn't require it at the time. And it was a really innovative class. It was already 7 years in the making, where it was a semester-long simulation of the state legislature. And down to the level where every class meeting was run through parliamentary procedure. Students declared political parties. They wrote legislation. They debated legislation. Ultimately, we had in-school field trips where we had committee hearings. What you see here on the screen is a picture of full session. Students sit by party on the respective sides of the auditorium and debate bills. And a mentor of mine had designed this class back in the mid-90s, and used to have lunch with him every day. And I said, Steve, why is this not the norm everywhere? And he was on the verge of retirement and handing this class off to me. And he said, Shawn, that's your job to figure out. So I feel like in many ways, I've spent the time since I've been in philanthropy now for 15 years, trying to realize that aspiration to disseminate best practices in civic learning throughout Illinois, and now with TED, trying to do this work nationally. So I want to get into what good civic learning looks like. TED mentioned the National Assessment for Educational Progress in Civics. We've been doing this for a while. Unfortunately, some of that testing has been defunded. So in recent years, we've only done the test for 8th grade. But there was a breakthrough study of the 1988 NAEP results that demonstrate, lo and behold, that if we teach civics, students score better on a test that measures their civic knowledge and skills. And basically said it was the quantity of civic education and the recency of civic education that resulted in students performing well on this test. Ted mentioned we just got new results less than 2 months ago on NAEP for 8th graders. And we found, for example, in middle school, students who took a class in 8th grade where civics was the main focus did best on this test, measuring their civic knowledge and skills. So teaching it matters a heck of a lot. My assignment in this segment is to talk about how we teach, and how we teach matters a lot too, as Ted said. Thanks to Ted's leadership under the campaign for the civic mission of schools, our field really over the last 2 decades has coalesced around best practices, which we increasingly are comfortable in calling proven practices. And there's a list I'm going to kind of walk through here with you. One of them is direct instruction, which is typically not a problem in a lot of parts of the country. Didactic instruction certainly is prevalent. There is a place for it. But also more experiential student-centered practices like discussing current and controversial issues, service learning, and simulations of democratic processes like the one I described in West Chicago, Illinois. Also, it matters how a school itself is governed. Is there student voice and participation in the governance of schools? And extracurricular opportunities are super important, and not just student council. There are all kinds of civic benefits from student participation in a range of extracurricular activities. I'm a data guy. I'm a political scientist that studies this stuff. So going to give you some data to back all of this up. But do want to add, through the Civics Now Coalition, we did a summit, a national summit back in 2017, published a report that accompanied this. It was really an update of that Civic Mission in Schools report, the Guardian of Democracy report. These are reports that were published in 2003 and 2011, respectively. This new report in 17 basically underlined those 6 practices and said, yes, there's also some complementary approaches to high quality civic learning, including news media literacy education, action civics, that's more experiential civic learning, the strong connection to social and emotional learning that we achieve through civic learning, and school climate, which we know is so important for a range of student outcomes. So I'll speak, to, as I said, to each of these in more details. In this report, I thought this graphic was particularly powerful. So we're not calling, we're not asking to make civic education great again, saying, yeah, there was this bygone era. We did used to teach it a lot more, but 21st century civics probably should look a lot different than its predecessor. So preparing students for a world where most of us aren't getting our news from printed newspapers anymore. We are hyper-polarized, by some measures as polarized as we've been since the Civil War. To engage this amazingly diverse generation is super important, and with frankly a teaching force that doesn't look like the students that we teach. And then this isn't something that we should just do for a semester in high school. Ted said there's 9 states that don't require this at all. Most states that do only require a semester. This is something that we have to do K-12. So into those practices a little bit, and I'm going to draw from research in the field and some of my own. This is a report that Ted had a hand in, a 2009 report that looked at international data and was particularly interested in what type of civics instruction drove outcomes that I think we all care about, like working hard, obeying the law, voting, paying attention to media. And note here, in each of these cases, the best outcomes are achieved in classrooms that have a mix of lecture and interactivity. So it's not one or the other, it's both. Getting into some of these best practices, this particular finding was one of the more powerful ones I gleaned from my analysis of the last time we tested high school students, which sadly was 2010. But the NAEP 2010 test for 12th graders, students performed best on this measure of their civic knowledge and skills when they talked about current events every day. That is particularly powerful given that this test does not measure current events, right? So current events brings things like our government institutions and our Constitution to life. Daily dosage was what I found was most powerful. Looking at middle schoolers in our most recent data from 2018, you can see there's a huge range here in the extent to which social studies classes in middle school engage students in discussions of current and what they call societal issues. We also know, looking at the 2018 NAEP for 8th graders, that when students participated regularly in debates or panel discussions, which relates to current and controversial issues, of course, they did much better on this test. So higher frequency, better scores. That West Chicago simulation I started with, it's actually been researched. There's been a couple of dissertations written about this. A fairly recent research report actually compared outcomes between this West Chicago simulation and AP students at a highly regarded high school in the Chicago area. And they found on lots of measures, those measures where there are 3 dots are the highest level of statistical significance. Students in this simulation-based government course outperformed and frankly made much larger gains than students who are in an AP class. And I know this high school, the teachers are superstars. So the way in which we teach matters a heck of a lot. Getting into the realm of service, unfortunately, NAEP doesn't ask questions about service learning. Last time they asked a question specifically about volunteer work was 1998. So I realized this data is quite old, but really powerful finding here I found as I looked at the 1998 NAEP and specifically at 12th graders, students who did volunteer work in the community, whether it was through school or on their own, vastly outperformed students who didn't do volunteer work. And the difference between students doing volunteer work from in school or on their own was not statistically significant. So the source of that volunteerism isn't important. And I will say there's huge inequities in terms of who does that service on their own. So by schools making these opportunities available, be it through classes or extracurricular opportunities, we can start closing some of these gaps that I'm going to end with. And then finally, just to state something that I don't know is incredibly obvious, when we talk about civic education, we often talk about what happens in a civics class or a government class. Of course, this can happen across the curriculum, but it also speaks about how a school is run. And I quote here from a developmental psychologist, Connie Flanagan, who talked about students who experienced civic climate at schools where fellow citizens learn to listen to and respect differences of opinions, and specifically young people's opinions. They saw the school as a mini polity. And frankly, most of our schools still are public schools. They are government institutions. How they function, how they're run, gives students a sense of how government functions and how government runs. So when we do student voice and school governance well, we can develop what I would call small d Democrats. Just to end and kind of touch back on what Ted talked about. So the results from our last NAEP, they've actually been flat across several years for 8th graders, but pretty lackluster results, where only 24% of 8th graders were deemed proficient in measures of their civic knowledge and skills. And then huge disparities in this is particularly important, obviously, in this moment, as we look at students of color and specifically our Hispanic and African-American students. So there very much is a civic achievement gap. We talk a lot about achievement gaps in math and reading, persistent in civics. And I want to say it's actually predictable. So much of this gap is actually a product of inequitable opportunities. So as I've looked at my own data, and other researchers have looked at this, when we look at exposure to best practices, when we look at ideal dosages, students of color, students who qualify for school lunch, students whose parents dropped out of high school, students who have low levels of English language proficiency are less likely to have access to these opportunities. So these so-called gaps are predictable. And I'm going to end with this. We have important research that suggests that demography is not destiny. And what you see up here is a graph, is a study of Chicago public school students, a longitudinal study. Researchers were interested in what drove a positive response to a question like, everyone has a responsibility to be concerned with state and local issues. And what you have up here in this graph is regression analysis. The big two things that drive this, look to the far left, are in-class civic learning opportunities and service learning. And look at things like demography, which yes, have some impact on student outcomes, but are dwarfed by these classroom-based civic learning opportunities. So demography is not destiny. In this moment where equity is finally a focus, civic learning, particularly through effective policy, can help address that. So we're going to pause there. Ted and I are happy to ask your questions before Ted gets into specific policy mechanisms that can help address and scale some of these best practices.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this is a time where if you have any questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask our guests here today. I'll give everybody just a few seconds to collect their thoughts. If not, I have a few questions to ask, but I want to give you all the chance to have first dibs at asking questions.
And if I can go ahead and take a stab at Amy's question here from Hawaii. Hello, Amy. Yes, we are prepared to respond to this moment. Shawn mentioned the civic learning opportunity gap, which we hope to work with policymakers in every state to ameliorate. As Shawn mentioned, kids going to schools serving predominantly students of color, lower SES status, high rates of free and reduced lunch are not getting the same equitable opportunity for civic learning experiences as kids attending schools in the suburb, serving principally white and higher SES communities. This is a gap that's got to be closed. In addition, the Civics Now Coalition, working with the Arizona State University and with the Saforza Center at Harvard University, it has received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to build a roadmap of how American history and civic education can best be taught in the 21st century. And going into that work is a lot of intention and intentionality on equity and telling American history the way it needs to be told. Honestly, straightforwardly, but remembering the genius of the founding period.
If I could build on that, Ted, one, just in the chat box, I put in a link of a framework that we helped underwrite called the Live Civics Framework, written by Kathy Cohen at the University of Chicago. Our friend Joe Kahn, who's one of the more prolific researchers in the civic learning field, and Jessica Marshall, who's ran Chicago Public Schools civic engagement work and now is pursuing her PhD at Northwestern. And it very much is a framework, and there was another question of the extent to which civics should include anti-racist teaching. And the framework is very much reflective of that. Young people need to see themselves in the curriculum of civic education. So it's actually not, and my slide did say part of these so-called gaps are a reflection of inequitable opportunities. Part of it, we think, speaks to the curriculum itself. So from where I stand, and I don't speak for Civics Now in this respect, but I speak for the McCormick Foundation, we certainly think anti-racist teaching should be part of that curriculum. We've started embedding some of those Live Civics principles into our work. Ted's going to speak to a school improvement model we have called Democracy Schools, where we've overlaid that Live Civics framework. And I'll also add there's a separate effort. iCivics is part of this with Generation Citizen that's looking specifically at equity in civics. We started our work about a year ago, and we plan to publish a paper on this in the fall. So I think the field is very much up to this. We've been centering on this work for quite a while, and we certainly think, yeah, now is the moment to make this case, to connect those dots. Frankly, the moment was probably yesterday, but I think we very much are ready to seize this moment as it is.
Thank you. That was super helpful.
And Pierce from South Carolina, we share your worry. Of course, the problems that I mentioned earlier about the squeezing of the curriculum far predate the pandemic, but we do definitely share your worry. And Amy, again, I love the Center for Civic Education too. I worked there for 10 years. And of course, CCE is in partnership with NCSL on Project Citizen.
Awesome.
All right. Well, we're going to come back to another period of Q&A after we continue on with our presentation. So we've heard about the sort of the present context of civic education in America, but now we're going to move our discussion towards what states can do to promote civic education. So I'm going to pop the screen back up, and Ted will tell us about a menu of policy options for states to consider around civics education.
Okay. There we go. And I'm getting a note that my bandwidth is low. Can you hear me okay, Austin?
I can hear you all right.
Okay. So I'm going to assume the rest of you can too. Last year, the Civics Now Coalition worked with about a dozen people leading the work who had experience with state policy, including a former member of NCSL, David Skaggs of Colorado, who was in the Colorado legislature, then went on to Congress, to develop this policy menu. And we deliberately chose the term menu. Education policy is a matter of the states, not the federal government. And we strongly believe in that. These are our best recommendations for you on how you can improve civic learning in your state. These recommendations are built on both experience and what research shows. So let's get into them. Next slide, please. And next one after that, sorry. There we go. State learning standards. Every state, of course, has standards in the social studies, social sciences, They might go by different names, but you got that animal in your state. As your state revises its social studies standards, we strongly urge you to make them fewer, clearer, higher. In a review of state standards done a few years ago, we found that so many were an overloaded laundry list of dead people's names and battles to memorize. You never could get to the civic disposition and behaviors part. So as each state updates its standards, we recommend, again, fewer, clearer, higher, and use the college and career and civic life framework for the social studies, which was developed by the leading 15 content organizations in history, both US and world, civics, economics, and geography a few years ago. All of this information, by the way, pardon me, we'll make available through Michelle there at NCSL and is available at CivXNow.org, CivXNow.org. So there's our recommendation on state standards. Make them fewer, clearer, higher, and use the C3 framework. Next slide, please. Assessment and accountability, or the third rail in education policy. Folks, like I said earlier, if it isn't tested, it isn't taught, isn't tried, it's a reality. We got 8 or 9 states that have meaningful assessment in civic education, depending on how you want to cut it. We have a number of states that administer to a degree or another the new citizens test of the Immigration Service. That's not enough. We recommend that every state has specific dedicated civic courses at upper elementary, in middle, and high school with an end of course objective state. We also recommend that states look at alternative forms of assessment, such as portfolio assessment and classroom-based assessment, which Tennessee and Washington State are experimenting with. Student achievement on civics assessment should have consequences beyond just course grade. They should have consequence for the student and consequence for the school itself. Most states have some form of school report card. Students' performance on civics assessment should be reflected and made available to the public through that. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we recommend that every state have dedicated course time, upper elementary, at least 1 semester in middle school, and preferably a full year standalone civic course in high school with attendant assessment that utilize the 6 proven practices plus 4 that Dr. Healy just ran us through a few minutes ago. These courses need to be tied and included into assessments that are part of the state's accountability system. Students should have the opportunity of experiencing, if you will, a civics lab. You're not going to graduate chemistry without going to a chemistry lab. Well, we should have civics labs too, where students get out into the community and experience what civic life is all about. And of course, states should take advantage of the interdisciplinary possibilities of civic education, including in English, in science class. Florida has just come up with a marvelous, marvelous reading list for their ELA classes, for their English classes that take into account civic material. Next slide, please. The greatest predictor of how well students are going to do in any subject area is a well-prepared teacher in front of the classroom. In far too many states today, to become a civics or history teacher, pardon me, all you need to have is an undergrad degree and to pass the Praxis 2 social science exam. That's not enough. We need to require a minimum of undergraduate coursework in American government and US history. We need to revise the current certification examinations to ensure every teacher has the fundamental knowledge they're going to need in order to teach. And we need to ensure that the schools of education are including work on the unique pedagogy of civics, including the use of experiential learning, guided classroom discussion of controversial issues, which is very important and very hard to do. So teachers need to be better prepared in this area. And next slide, they need to be supported throughout their career through effective professional development. Unfortunately, we've seen, especially since the Great Recession of 10 years ago, professional development opportunities for social studies teachers, for history teachers, for civics teachers have been decimated. States need to develop programs that help recruit teachers who are more reflective of the population, and every state needs to provide more effective ongoing professional development opportunities, including professional development opportunities for math, literacy, and science teachers so they can help meet the civic mission of their schools. Next slide, please. Equity. We talked about the civic learning opportunity gap, which leads to the civic learning demonstration gap. We recommend the assessments that we do partly to attack this gap and end it. We strongly recommend that every state report the results of its civic assessments and disaggregate the data by student groups to show where there are gaps so policymakers can make informed decisions on where to put resources. States should provide funding and technical assistance to support schools that are struggling in providing high quality civic learning, and states should ensure equitable funding for currently underserved school populations. This is vitally important. Next slide, please. Implementation. Policies don't implement themselves, and you legislators and legislative staff know that better than most people. You pass a marvelous bill and you hand it off to the executive branch. Any governors on this call? Well, sorry. And it doesn't get implemented like the legislature intended. Implementation matters. We recommend that every single state establish an entity, perhaps a private sector public partnership, to ensure there's information about best practices available to every school, a database of civic learning resources available to every school. Here's something I should have mentioned earlier, is the decline in the amount of time and attention has happened with civic learning. At the same time, there's been a revolution of innovation in how to teach this stuff in a 21st century manner. We mentioned the Center for Civic Education earlier. They've been part of this revolution of innovation. iCivics, a program founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, which involves computer simulation games of governmental processes. The programs of the Constitutional Rights Foundation. I could go on and on. The supplemental civic learning education community has led this revolution of innovation, and word on this and the availability of this, and mostly these are free programs available to every school in the country. Word needs to get out that they're available. So implementation matters. Establish an entity to help oversee implementation in your state. Next slide, please. Youth voice matters. Youth should have an opportunity to test drive our democracy by opportunities to participate age appropriate while they're in school. Student councils need to be more than about picking the prom colors. They should represent the voice of the students to school administration. Every local school board and every state board of education should have youth representation. Schools and districts should work with local units of government to find student participation in public decision-making bodies, perhaps a youth representative to the city council, to the county commission. Students should be able to work with local government representatives to make issues of concern to them known to governmental entities. So youth voice matters, and we need to be more intentional on how we learn from youth and listen to youth. Next slide, please. School culture, climate, and leadership matters. Shawn mentioned this a few minutes ago. Schools and districts should ensure that policies and daily practices, including student discipline, reflect democratic ideals and principles, not a dictatorship. States should provide adequate funding and training for district and school leaders on how to make sure that school climate, culture, and leadership is more equitable. And one more slide. Democracy schools. There are currently 7 states in the country who've modeled a program that was started by Shawn Healy and his colleagues in the state of Illinois. There are democracy school programs in California. There's a program in Arizona and Connecticut and Kansas. And I'm leaving a state or two out, I know. What democracy schools are all about are schools that commit to a rigorous self-evaluation and commit to improving how they approach civic learning, are recognized by state officials for their efforts. Tennessee has just started a wonderful program. Governor Lee instituted this last year, where schools that commit to doing better in civic learning actually have an opportunity to get some state funding. So again, there's information on the democracy school programs at the CivXNow.org website or at the McCormick Foundation. We urge you to replicate these programs. Now, this has been a quick run through of our policy menu, our recommendations to you state policymakers. Shawn and I and our state level affiliates across the country are available to state legislators, and staff at any time to help you develop a program to improve civic learning in your state. Now, back over to Shawn to show some exemplary practices from around the country.
Thanks, Ted. I'm just going to share my screen again, so bear with me here. Here we go. Okay, so want to just give a couple of examples of states that have innovated, and as Ted referenced, we've been really active in the state of Illinois. This is a picture from last spring when we were all standing close together last May at our state capitol in Springfield with Governor Pritzker. These are middle school students and teachers, part of a program called Our American Voice, where students engage in service projects, often projects related to improving their own schools. It turned into a quasi lobby day because at the time we had a middle school civics bill making its way through the legislature and was ultimately signed by the guy in the middle. So I'll get to that, but want to talk about innovation that's happened in a few other states. One, Florida. This is really the state that led the way. It's a state that we've learned a lot from. In 2010, they passed the Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Learning Act and required a middle school civics course, which also included, to Ted's point about assessment, a high stakes test in civics. And I can tell you in speaking with our friends in Florida, our colleagues in Florida, and actually going down there and studying how they implemented this law, they care a lot about civics in Florida, and partly it's because of this test. Literally is tied into student promotion to high school and is part of schools' grades. So 12.5% of school grades are tied to student performance in this test. They also recognize point 3 up here that civics should be embedded across the curriculum. So civics content is incorporated into elementary grades. And then they also acknowledge that this stuff costs money. So the state over time has appropriated money for things like curriculum development, analysis of test data, which you can see over time scores have risen pretty dramatically, and teacher professional development, which I have to say as a funder myself, that is the secret sauce, to Ted's point about teacher capacity. To disseminating best practices, you need to do teacher professional development at scale. Massachusetts is a more recent innovator. That's Governor Charlie Baker signing legislation in 2018 that provided support for revising civics and history standards, as Ted talked about the importance of standards and incorporating civic learning practices into those. They developed a Civics Project Trust Fund, which draws upon both public and private resources to help underwrite student projects at both the middle and high school levels. And then they also, and I'm going to come back to this in Illinois, they've required that districts offer a high school voter challenge. So seizing on elections, to Austin's point at the top of today's webinar, elections are teachable moments. Seizing on that opportunity, and young people, as we know, are the least likely to participate. That doesn't have to be the case. And frankly, if we get young people voting early, they're going to vote often across a lifetime. And then the final state before I'll turn to the land of Lincoln is Arizona. They are one of those states, which is, I'll skip down to point 4 here, that emulated our Democracy Schools program, actually ran it through their Department of Education and created something called the Excellence in Civic Education program that recognizes schools for their commitments to high quality civic learning. Most recently, 2018, they recognized 31 schools for that. Like Massachusetts, they've adopted new history and social studies standards. They've also created a seal of civic literacy for students who one have a 3.0 or above in social studies courses, but also do some supplemental civic learning opportunities. And then have a 5-year pilot program they've debuted where participating schools launch an innovative civics course, which has lots of digital components to it, also a summative assessment, and there's state funding for this. So these are a few of the states that are really innovating. I've had the privilege of being part of parallel efforts in the state of Illinois and led a state task force on civic education that did this work, or convened 6 years ago. And we're tasked with doing a number of things, but ultimately making policy recommendations. You see the 6 recommendations that we made to our state legislature at the end of 2014. And they're reflective of a lot of those recommendations of the state policy menu that Ted just walked through. And we've been busy ever since, been busy advocating for these recommendations and have had some success. And then to Ted's other point, been in the field implementing these policies. I'm lucky to work in philanthropy where we've been able to help resource some of those opportunities. We've committed to it, the McCormick Foundation, but brought other funders into this mix also. So in 2015, built a bipartisan coalition. I should say every effort that we've done, we've worked adamantly, even in a bright blue state like Illinois, to make this bipartisan. In fact, the governor pictured on the screen was a Republican Rauner who signed this bill. And I'm proud to say when we got that high school civics bill passed in 2015, we had a majority of the Republican caucus, almost unified support in the Democratic caucus. And we took those best practices, as you can see here, and embedded them into a required high school semester-long course that was implemented in the fall of 2016. We also worked with the State Board of Education to update our social studies standards. We used that college, career, and civic life framework that Ted spoke to earlier. Those standards were implemented as of the 2017-2018 school year. They are K-12. And then our most recent breakthrough, as I alluded to at the top, was a middle school civics course requirement, which very much parallels our high school requirement and actually takes effect this fall. So we are virtually in the field as of right now, leading weekly seminars, webinars for teachers on both pedagogy and content. The picture at the bottom of the screen is Representative Camille Lilly, who represents the west side of Chicago and the immediate west suburbs. She was the champion and our House sponsor of this legislation. And then finally, as I said, elections are teachable moments, and we've had some really good innovations on that front too, as we speak to a group that convenes state legislators, including opportunities for young people to vote as early as 17 in primaries, This was led by high school students, and you can see Governor Quinn here on the football field at Stevenson High School signing this law. Governor Rauner, a couple of years back, signed legislation bringing Illinois into a group of states now, over 10, that have automatic voter registration. And we anticipate bringing up to 2 million new people, new voters into our system. Those voters disproportionately young people. And then finally, as we look to the fall, we're in the process of scaling up something that's been going on in our state for a couple of decades, but state law allows young people to serve as election judges, high school juniors and seniors, given the danger that this in-person election poses to particularly our older poll workers. We're in the process of scaling up this opportunity. So viewing elections as teachable moments, and as we see as part of a comprehensive view in strengthening our state civic education system. So once again, I'm going to pause there, and Ted and I are happy to answer your questions as it relates to the state policy menu and some of the breakthroughs we've seen in a handful of states across the country.
Give everybody a second to think about questions. Again, chat box or unmute yourself. But I have a question for you guys. I used to be a high school teacher in a non-tested subject, and it was in a school that was needed to improve its test scores, and that was the main focus for the year. And I feel like that might be a barrier to civics education. What do you say to maybe a principal or a district official or maybe even a state legislator that says, well, we can't focus on civics education right now. We've got to get English test scores up. How would you respond?
Well, I'd say that you're, well, I wouldn't insult you, but I'd say that you can't not teach civics if you want to achieve those goals. One, you know, the classic example of take reading, for example, and there's a study that actually gave students a passage on baseball, and then gave them a comprehension test after reading this. And the sample of students, half of the students were highly proficient readers. The other half of those students knew a lot about baseball. Who did better on that reading comprehension test? Right, the students that knew more about baseball. So content is a great gateway to literacy. And that's just one example. There's, as you can see from the slides that I put on earlier, I'm a math geek, I'm a stats geek. So math is also something civics is also a gateway to mathematical proficiency. I'm really excited. We're in the process of, we're supporting a study in Chicago Public Schools where they've embedded 24 measures of both civic learning opportunities and outcomes, and are starting to explore relationships between those civic learning inputs and outcomes like grade point average, student attendance, on-time graduation, and our year one results. So these are just correlations. We're going to do 3 years of analysis, demonstrate that there are strong relationships between those civic learning interventions and outcomes, frankly, that, as you acknowledge, schools are rewarded and punished for. So that's not the only reason you do civic learning, but I would suggest it will help you in boosting those test scores that you're held accountable for. Ted, please build on that.
And I would add, Austin, I certainly wouldn't blame the local administrator or the teacher. It's policymakers that are making these decisions. And I would remind policymakers, some people are going to become engineers. Some people are going to become mathematicians. Some people are going to become writers. All students will become citizens who need civic knowledge, civic skills, civic disposition, and civic behaviors.
I appreciate those responses. Give everyone just a second. If anyone has another question, I certainly have one more if we don't from our audience, but I'll give everyone a chance to unmute themselves and ask away if they have one. Okay, well, I have one more question for you guys, and I'm curious, the context of our conversation is about 21st century civics education, and obviously over the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, we've seen a significant change in how everybody, particularly our younger generation, receives information about the world. How are current civics programs responding to this change, and are there any policies or recommendations for policymakers that can help students navigate so much information that they have available to them?
What a timely question, and we didn't coordinate this, Austin. Yesterday, the Civics Now affiliate in the great empire state of New York released recommendations for state-level policymakers on media literacy. It's a superb document. Media literacy, digital citizenship is part of 21st century life, part of 21st century skills that students have to develop. We will ensure NCSL gets a copy of the Democracy Ready New York, which is the name of the New York campaign, recommendations for policymakers on digital and media literacy. I'll also add that increasingly, policymakers, at least at the national level, are growing concerned about the national security role of civic learning in making sure through media literacy, through basic civic education, students can discern foreign actors' attempts at influence. The Center for Strategic and International Studies did a study last year showing attempts by malign foreign actors to undermine respect for the rule of law and the independence of our judiciary. We have to equip students to be able to spot this and not fall for it.
You see, we have a question that just came in, and it's about providing this type of civic education in rural areas with small schools. Do you have any specific recommendations for those contexts?
You know, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. So our Democracy Schools program is a statewide program in Illinois. And Illinois looks a lot like the country. And we have this big city of Chicago, this vast suburban area, and then lots of rural areas. And you go to Southern Illinois, it feels like the South. There's a school that we work with in Southern Illinois called Shawn Healy High School. It's actually a junior and high school. So both junior high and high school are together. And I believe about 100 students in the whole high school. One social studies teacher, one of the best ones I've ever met. Her name's Jamie Nash Mayberry. And so she literally teaches these students over the course of 4 years. And the big issue in Jamie's community is the Mississippi River, and specifically the I'm forgetting the terminology, the levees. Thank you, Ted. The levees were built to last 50 years. They're over 60 years old now. When and if they break, they will flood the farmland that surrounds the school and is the livelihood for most of these families. And Jamie, over the course of several years, because she gets to work with these students over 4 years, they've engaged both local and national policymakers. They've even gone to St. Louis, where the federal district court is based, and essentially engaged public policymakers in beginning to address some of these issues, and done this not just in a civics class, which Jamie teaches, but across the different social studies courses, and rallied the community as a result. So that's just one example. But I think, you know, any good policy solution has flexibility, allows the application of a state policy to local context. So I just hold up that example, and that's one of many, and the great work that I've been privileged to do in this state.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I see we're a couple minutes past the hour, so I think it's now time to wrap up. But I want to thank you both, Ted and Dr. Healy, for joining us here today, and thank you to our audience for your participation today. I hope you learned a lot. I sure did. We will have the recording of this webinar posted on the NCSL website, as well as any materials from this presentation. I know we talked about a number of resources throughout this presentation that we will make sure to post and share with you all. And then finally, looking ahead, I'll get my screen shared here. Oh, no, that's not going to do it. You know, I'm still not perfect with the screen sharing. You'd think I would be at this point. There we go. We have a couple more webinars in our series. Next Tuesday, we'll be talking about state revenue forecasts and the tracking of federal and state education spending. We'll be joined by Erica McKellar and Dan Thatcher from NCSL, as well as myself, and Mike Griffith from the Learning Policy Institute. We'll be talking all things ed funding, federal and state. And then finally, we'll have our final meeting of this series, which will be concerning the navigating of challenging times using evidence-based policymaking. And we will be joined by Christine Goodwin from NCSL, who just launched this initiative. So we appreciate everybody being here today. Thanks so much for your time, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.